Hi, folks. We're going to get started. Welcome. My name is Michael Romali. I run the public policy programs here at Philanthropy New York, for those of you who don't know me. And you'll notice that there is no sound coming from this microphone. But that's because we are live streaming this program, so the microphones in the room are to pick up the sound for the external audience. It's not amplifying in the room, so there's no feedback sound. So my job is only to welcome you, as I just have, and to introduce Adam, who is going to kick off the program and introduce our main speakers. I think you all know Adam already, so I won't introduce him. So.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. So, and there's empty chairs, so feel free to come on in. There's one here, there's one there. Not going to make this go too long, but just real quick, my name is Adam Leibowitz. I am the Food and Environment Program Officer at North Star Fund, and my main role there is to coordinate a network of philanthropic entities, of funders and donors in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area called Community Food Funders. Many of you have been to our events, are involved with Community Food Funders, so you know about us, but if not, there was a little handout up front, or you can check us out online, communityfoodfunders.org, and on that handout there, we have a bunch of upcoming events this spring, so you should feel free to keep joining us. I think that's about it. Okay, and so today what we're going to do is the first half of our meeting will be a presentation from Eric, similar in nature to what we heard yesterday at the Just Food Conference, for those of you that were there. And then we're going to try to save close to an hour for just conversation, Q&A, discussion, and hoping that that's going to be robust and lively. The way that this came about for us at Community Food Funders is we have pretty explicitly values of listening to those most impacted by the broken system and an acknowledgement that the people that are most impacted by an injustice are the ones that need to be on the front lines of changing that and fixing that. And we like to be in partnership with those in the field. Easier said than done, and we haven't always lived up to those values, but we have begun internally first in the steering committee of CFF a discussion about what it means to explicitly be tackling race and equity and injustice in the food system. It's a slow and sometimes difficult conversation, but it's one we're trying to have privately and publicly and everything in between. And so that's why we were really excited when we had the opportunity to bring Eric in. And this is our, hopefully just first attempt at an ongoing conversation and effort that we'd love to bring all of you in and others into thinking through this and talking about what we can be doing more tangibly and more explicitly. So, but we have a small enough group that I think it's great if we were to go around and just do some introductions before we get started. Don't worry about the microphone for that part. But if you could just say, your name, what organization you're with, and your connection to food, I guess. So I'm Adam, again, North Star Food Environment Program Officer.
Hi, Allison Cohen. I'm the Senior Director of Program. Looking at
food and food justice and sustainable agriculture. I'm Samantha Franklin. I'm a program officer with the Johnson Family Foundation, and we were also at the Just Food Conference yesterday. We're trying to start a new food justice funding program. So,
Good afternoon. My name is Libby Wan. I work at the Ford Foundation in the Quality Employment Unit. So mostly touch on food and kind of the work chain, food worker. And yeah.
I'm Charlotte Diller. I'm with the Ralphie Ogden Foundation, my mom, and we are working on a agricultural project in Chester, New York.
And I'm Bea Stern, and I'm president of the Ralphie Ogden Foundation. I'm here with my daughter, Charlotte. And we are the lead investors in an agricultural project, as Charlotte said, in Chester, New York. The project is around increasing access to land for farmers, but we intend it also to address issues of equity and labor in the agricultural sector.
My name is Molly Reardon. I'm part of the Hudson Valley Farm Hub in Hurley, New York, and that is part of Local Economies Project of the New World Foundation.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Salemi, and I am a program assistant with the Local Economies Project at the New World Foundation, which is in Kingston, New York, also in Ulster County. And just 2 weeks into my position. And most recently, I was previously the coordinator for the New York City Food Forum. So transitioning from sort of a practitioner space, coalition space, into a foundation philanthropy space.
I am Michael Romali. I run the public policy and communications programs here at Philanthropy New York, and so I am charged with coordinating the activities of all the various issue-based working groups and trying to find synergies between them.
Hi, I'm Thomas Helmick. I'm with the Rockefeller Foundation. I'm also on the leadership committee of Brooklyn Food Coalition, and I have an MA in food systems from NYU.
I'm Amanda Navarro with PolicyLink, and I'm also here representing the New York City Food Forum.
Good afternoon, everyone. Dara Cooper with Bed-Stuy Restoration Corporation, also representing the New York Food Forum.
My name is Beatrice Beckford. I'm the co-director of the Grassroots Action Network at Why Hunger, and here also representing the New York City Food Forum.
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Kolu Zigbee. I am a program director at the Jesse Smith Noyce Foundation for Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems, and a member of the steering committee of Community Food Funders.
Hi, I'm Barbara Greenberg from Levitt Foundation. Our focus is youth-powered food justice, and I'm also a member of the steering committee of Community Food Funders.
I had mine.
My name is Michelle Bay, and I'm a program associate at the Lauriam Tisch Elimination Fund, where we fund programs that provide healthy food access in New York City.
Yes, hi, I'm Sarah Brannon. I'm on the steering committee of Community Food Funders. I'm also with the Local Economies Project of the New World Foundation.
So I'm Hugh Hogan. I'm the executive director of the North Star Fund. For those who don't know, North Star, we fund grassroots organizing and activism across a broad spectrum of race and social justice issues, and we also provide services to donors and donor organizing. And along with Kolu and Barbara and a couple others in the room, got Community Food Funders off the ground about 4 years ago now. So I'm delighted to see how many people are in the conversation.
Elsky Jones, Deputy Director of Resource and Strategy at North Star Fund.
Okay, great. Thank you all. Now on with the show. So, this is Eric. Eric Holtimenes has been Executive Director of Food First since 2006. It was called one of the country's, quote, most established food think tanks by the New York Times. Food First, or the Institute for Food and Development Policy, celebrates its 40th anniversary this year. And so Eric is here as on one of his stops on the 40th anniversary tour, celebrate this anniversary. And you can catch him at more events tomorrow and Wednesday around the city, and if you want to follow them around across the Northeast and into the South for the next couple of weeks. Food First was founded in 1975 by Joseph Collins and Frances Moore Lappé, the author of Diet for a Small Planet. And Food First has gone on to publish over 60 books, exploding commonly held myths about hunger and food production. Recently, with Eric's leadership, they've created a new priority of dismantling racism in the food system. So Eric himself is the editor of the Food First book, Food Movements Unite, Strategies to Transform Our Food Systems, the co-author of Food Rebellions, Crisis and the Hunger for Justice with Raj Patel and Annie Shattuck, and author of the book Campesino a Campesino, Voices from Latin America's Farmer-to-Farmer Movement for Sustainable Agriculture, as well as many academic, magazine, and news articles. Hopefully you saw we linked to quite a few of them on the webpage for this, so if you want to read up on that, you can. He's of Basque and Puerto Rican heritage, grew up milking cows and pitching hay in Point Reyes, California. After studying rural education and biology at the University of Oregon and Evergreen State College, he traveled through Mexico and Central America, where he was drawn to the simple life of small-scale farmers and stayed for over 25 years. Is that right? In Eric's words, successful social movements are formed by integrating activism with livelihoods. These integrated movements create the sustained social pressure that produces political will, the key to changing the financial, governmental, and market structures that presently work against sustainability. So let's all welcome Eric Holt Jimenez.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and I especially want to thank Adam and Kolu for putting this together and for the invitation. So those of you who were at the talk last night, I think there's several of you, I'm going to ask for your patience because basically I'm giving the same talk. I'm going to switch it up a little bit out of deference to not boring you. But basically we're going to be talking about the same things. And I just want to start by sort of explaining a little bit why is Food First doing this? Why is this a concern to us? We've been around for 40 years. Celebrating this 40th anniversary makes me feel 40 again. It's great. But, you know, Frances Moore Lappé, when she wrote Diet for a Small Planet, she had actually dropped out of graduate school and was researching the issues of hunger and the environment just on her own, with no help from anybody, and just sort of out in the wilderness there in the library at UC Berkeley, trying to find what she could find. There was no internet back then, of course. And she was astounded to find primarily two things, which were true 40 years ago, and are still true today, which is a bit disturbing. One, that there was more than enough food to feed everybody, and yet we still had millions of people going hungry. In fact, 1.5 times enough food to feed every man, woman, and child on the planet 40 years ago. And that's still true today. And yet, back then we had 600 million people going hungry, and now we've got over 1 billion people going hungry. I know that the United Nations has changed the way they measure hunger in order to drop the number of hungry people down, but in fact we do have around 1 billion or more hungry people, 1 in 7. That's about the same as the United States in terms of food insecurity. So what's happening in the United States very much reflects what's happening around the world, even though we happen to be the richest country in the world that produces more food than anybody else. So Food First has always been concerned with the injustices that cause hunger, but we always looked at it from a very international lens. But since I've been at Food First, we've had since before I got to Food First, our board of directors changed. It's not the same board of directors, and it's certainly not the same demographic that you would have seen 40 years ago at Food First. Now, we stand on some very tall shoulders, but my board of directors is basically a board of directors of people of color, many of whom, if not most of whom, have come up from the neighborhoods, very much engaged with issues of justice and food. And I would say foundational to the food justice movement. So when I got to Food First, even though I was coming in from 25 years working with peasant movements in Latin America, it was very clear that what they wanted me to work on, as well as the international work, was in fact work in the United States. And because of the fact that the United States, in many ways, was not that much better off than you would expect it to be when you compare it to hunger, malnutrition, and now, of course, diet-related disease and around the world. And just to say one more thing about Food First, I suppose, that Food First also, over time, when that New York Times accolade was written, we were just a think tank that concerned with food, and one of the only ones around. So that's why it wasn't too hard to become the foremost. Aside from the very fine work of Francis Moulipe and Joe Collins and Walden Bello and others, but food per se was not that big of an issue, and certainly a food system was not considered as an issue. Hunger was considered an issue, but people thought that people were going hungry because of scarcity. And it was, in fact, Frankie's brilliance to show that no, that's not it at all. In fact, there are injustices that cause hunger. And then Food First, since that time, has been looking at the systemic aspect of these injustices. Why is it that injustices don't go away? Why do we continually appear, and how do they appear, and why do they appear? And why don't we see them? Why aren't they apparent to us? And of course, the answer is because they're structured in and taken as reality. So, Food First as Food First became more and more engaged with these issues, we began to engage with the people who were fighting the injustices, engage with the people who were trying to make these injustices evident, make them visible. And so we began working more and more closely with social movements, with organizations, community organizations and whatnot, but with large social movements, with the women's movement, with the peasant movement, and then, of course, with the food movement here in the United States. And so what we try to do is we try to amplify the voices and the experiences of the people who are on the front lines trying to change these structures and the practices of the injustices that cause hunger. Right? And we also try to provide an analysis, a more structured analysis about why these injustices don't go away. And so both to try and support the social movements who are working to end hunger, and to try to engage the general public and get them to understand hunger in deeper and more structural and systemic ways. So, to talk about food justice and dismantling racism for us is obviously, for us, was a very natural step. Because if one looks at the injustices that cause hunger around the world, if one looks at the injustices that causes hunger in the United States, and if one looks at the challenges that social movements face in order to confront and dismantle these injustices, dismantling racism is inescapable if you want to transform the food system. So we very much see a dialectical relationship between changing the food system, and not just reforming it, but transforming the food system. And I'll explain why that's so important to us, and dismantling racism. Now, when I came back from Latin America, by the way, I was raised on farms. We were farm workers, actually. We didn't have any land in Northern California. I worked on dairies. I tried to get off the farm as much as I could, and I kept being drawn back. I worked my way through college by working on farms because that's what I knew how to do, and I still had a back that worked. And then when I got my degree, afterwards I went to, in education and biology, I went to Latin America to study rural education, and that's where I fell in with the, quote, the simple life. Actually, I fell in with a farmers' movement. I fell in with a peasant movement, and then back on the farm again, you know. So, but the point is that when I came back 25 years later, I found this vibrant food movement in the United States that had not existed when I left. And the whole conversation, which before I'd been familiar with and engaged with around labor, rights of farm workers, because I was a farm worker, had completely morphed and grown, and was actually, for me at first, was quite confusing, because people were talking about, good food, just food, fair food. I mean, all these things, and I didn't really, it was a maze, and I was amazed. But I think it was very exciting, and I think it still is very exciting. And if we look at the development of the sort of broader, very loosely termed food movement, it's extremely diverse. I know Michael Pollan likes to call it, fragmented and whatnot. Well, it is. It's also stratified, and it is somewhat atomized. And there's all of the sort of social and economic and racial contradictions and tensions which we see in society. Of course, we're going to see within the food movement itself. They're in the food system. One would expect they would be reflected within the food movement. And this, I think, is one of the food movement's big challenges. But celebrating the food movement, which I think we should, all these fantastic things that have been happening around food, we also have to ask ourselves, if it's so great, if these things are so great, why isn't everybody doing them? Why aren't there CSAs all over the place? And why are they the alternative rather than the norm? Why is local food, organic food, the alternative rather than the norm? And why do we have still 1 in 7 people going hungry in the United States? And even more so, why is it that people of color have the highest rates of food insecurity, the highest rates of diet-related disease? Why are the workers in the food system those who have the highest rates of food insecurity and diet-related disease of all workers? So, I mean, these contradictions, I think, have to be directly addressed. And I think that it's very difficult to address these contradictions if we just look at the United States. I really think that we have to see the United States go beyond U.S. exceptionalism and see the United States as part of a much larger trend in global food. And so here we have, hunger, which of course hit the headlines again in 2008 when we had our last 2 food crises. And immediately people called again, as they have for the last half century, for producing more food. Now, we know that producing more food is not the answer. We've known this for 40 years. However, even scientists now, fairly mainstream social scientists and food and agricultural scientists also know this to be true. So if you just look back, just a few years here, and this trend you can take back for quite a ways, you can see that we've been increasing the amount of food per capita by 12% a year. That means each of us should have had 12% more food each year for the last 20 years. And yet, now we have 1 billion hungry people. How can this be? In fact, the number of hungry people has also been increasing by about 11% a year. So it's on par with increases in production. And if you look, the lines behind me, both malnutrition and poverty are flat. The blue and orange dots. That's flat, even though food production is increasing. So clearly, this is not a problem of scarcity. Right? Now, if you look at the food crisis, you look at for the last century, over a century now, the price of food has been going down. And quite simply, that's because we've been producing more of it. And there's more product than demand. And so the price goes down. And it's been going down and going down until 2008. This is the food price index. This is what grains and food sell for on the international market. And then suddenly in 2008, the price of food literally shoots off the charts. The food price index goes above and beyond anything we've ever seen before in the history of the food price index. it did it again in 2011. So here you see the curves, constant and current prices. Don't worry about the difference. The curves overlap, are congruent. So it goes up. You see a jump in 2008. You see another jump in 2011. And you see the steady curve of the price of food going steadily upwards over that time. It goes up, it comes back down, it doesn't go back down to where it was before. So it's steadily increasing through these periods of volatility. The red lines that you see are the frequency of food riots, which we call food rebellions. In our book we wrote shortly after the food crisis, basically that's why it's called food rebellions. So in the first food crisis of 2008, we saw, I don't know, 150 food rebellions or something around the world. And some of them happen in places where you would expect. Haiti, for example, where many poor people were subsisting on what they call mud biscuits. You take some soil and some lard, you make a biscuit and bake it. And this is traditionally used for women who are pregnant or lactating to access minerals. It's not just any dirt. I mean, it's special soil that you use, clay. But people were buying these things now just to stave off hunger, because they were cheap. So of course you would have a food riot there. But you had them in Italy, and you had them in Milwaukee. You had them in many places where you would not expect to see a food riot. Right? But if you look at Haiti, what happened when people rioted, they did not storm the warehouses where the donations of food from Public Law 480 were kept, where all the rice, the Miami rice they call it, is kept. They didn't do that. They stormed the National Palace. They drove the Prime Minister out. So these were not riots. These were rebellions against an unjust food system, which was incapable of solving a very simple problem. Here is the food, here is the people. Why can't you just get them together? And the answer lies both in the contradictions in the structure of our global food system. Because at the time of I should just mention the second spike in 2011, where you have the red lines clumped so tightly together, that's the Arab Spring. So you can imagine this got the attention of world leaders, because suddenly these food riots are toppling. Every single rebellion in the Arab Spring started with a food-related riot. So this gets government's attention. But when they looked at the problem, what they saw was there were record harvests in 2008 and 2011. The world had never produced so much food in the history of the world. And again, over 1.5 times enough food to feed everybody. We were getting record hunger, over 1 billion people. We'd never seen that before. But we're also record profits were being made by the multinationals, the oligopolies that control the international food system. So the grain companies, ADM, for Arch Daniels Midlands or Cargill, the supermarkets, Tesco, Carrefour, Safeway, Walmart, and certainly the suppliers, Monsanto and whatnot. We're seeing record profits at the time 1 billion people were going hungry around the world. Now, the two charts here show is that you see our red line there. That's the food index again, National Food Price Index. And there's the two spikes in 2008 and then goes up again in 2011. So these are where, for example, the grain companies made all their money. The price of grain goes up. They make all that money. And it was a lot of money. Billions of dollars are made. And this is very important. The blue line is what you pay for food in the store. So that part of the blue line, after the spike, where it remains flat even though world grain prices, food prices go down, those are the windfall profits for the retailers, the large monopolies. Right? That's where Walmart and Carrefour and Tesco make their big bucks. Now, you would think that this was, and I remember that they were being questioned about this. You're making all this money while 1 billion people are going hungry. You know what? And they said, don't ask us how we make the money. Ask us what we do with it. Well, what do you do with it? So we invest it to make more money. What do you think we do with it? I mean, that's what you're supposed to do, right? In fact, that's by law. That's what you have to do as a corporation. This actually ended up becoming a problem for the corporations, these very large monopolies, because all that accumulation of capital has to go somewhere. You can't just keep it in the bank. You have to reinvest it. You certainly don't want all these profits in the form of money, which is losing value. You want to reinvest them in something which makes more value, makes more wealth, makes more money, more capital. If you don't, you're going to lose out. You're going to lose the value of your profits, and somebody else is going to invest their profits, and they're going to beat you out in the marketplace. So this next graph you see behind me, the blue one, that's the, and you see it perfectly matches the first graph of the food price index. That's the stock price value of Monsanto shares. This one right here. It says MON at the top. So Monsanto, the value of Monsanto shares go up while Monsanto is making record profits. But as the price of food goes down, Monsanto shareholders pull their money out of Monsanto and its stock price begins to drop. Because Monsanto has a crisis of accumulation. It has all this money. It has to reinvest it in order to make its shareholders happy. If it doesn't, they're going to take their money out and go somewhere else. So Monsanto had what we call a crisis of accumulation. And this is very important because it shows that the global food system follows a logic of capital and of demand and of finance rather than a logic of feeding the world or ending hunger or sustainable agriculture or anything else. At the end of the day, these bottom lines are very big bottom lines in determining what happens in the world food system. Now, I'm not talking about small operators here. They're subject to these movements, but these companies make things move. So how did we get to this place, and what does that mean for our food system, and what does it mean for people of color in our food system, not just in the United States, but internationally? One way of understanding our food system is through the analysis of, or the framework of food regimes. It has been developed by Phil McMichael and Harriet Friedman. Phil from University of Cornell and Harriet from University of Toronto. And basically what they say is a food regime is a food system governed by rules on a global scale. So think of all of the rules and all of the institutions which govern our food globally. So one of the institutions, of course, would be the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization. The USDA actually affects the price of food on a world scale. And the rules would be things like the US Farm Bill, which practically determines the price of food on a world scale. And the rules of the World Trade Organization and the free trade agreements. These are the rules, right? So that makes up the food regime. Where did it come from? If you think historically about the food regime, it begins with colonialism and European imperialism, which in the expansion of European imperialism basically conquers people in the global south and then directs the resources and the surplus from the global south, dispossesses, and then directs the resources from the global south to the global north. Among those resources is food. And so very cheap food, because it's basically food from lands and people who have been plundered, and who in great degree are people of color, is going from the south to the north. And this tremendous subsidy basically allows the North to industrialize. It's what finances the Industrial Revolution. And similar processes took place within Europe as well, in terms of the countryside and the city, dispossessing people, enclosing the commons, destroying local communities for several hundred years to basically supply the industry with cheap food and cheap labor. The second stage, what happens next is that the Green Revolution comes in after World War II. We have all these excess nitrates and excess poisons from the war, which are then turned into agricultural inputs. And we have tremendous capacity in the United States to build machinery, and we have lots of oil, right? And so basically, the Green Revolution in the United States is about mechanizing and industrializing agriculture. Tremendous surplus of food is produced, which we can't consume in the United States or in Europe. After Europe rebuilds, it can't consume this food either. So where does the food go? Well, in the first instance, it goes to the Global South. But the Global South already feeds itself. The Global South is doing two things. One, they're supplying the North with cheap food, and two, they're feeding themselves. Right? So it's necessary to break down the food systems of the Global South, destroy the local markets of the Global South in order to sell the products from the Global North in the Global South. Right? It's also necessary to loan them some money so they can buy these products, which puts them in debt. Then what happens in the North is that the input companies saturate their markets, and they make tremendous profits at this. But again, they have a crisis of accumulation as well. So where to sell all the tractors, the fertilizers, the pesticides, the seeds, the hybrid seeds? The Global South. So that's the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution is a project, a campaign, if you like, to transfer the mode of industrial agricultural production from the Global North to the Global South. And it has tremendous consequences for people in the Global South because these are large-scale projects. And they don't work on small farms very well. And so particularly you want the finest bottom land, the flat land, the land which can be irrigated, basically the land which can be capitalized. And so of course the banks on Wall Street and on Hyde Street loan money to the governments of the Global South so that they can buy these inputs from the Global North and industrialize their agriculture. It does two things. First, it displaces the peasantry up onto the hillsides and out into the agricultural frontier, where so they begin chopping down forests to create land, clearing land, and creates the slums. Huge influx of people into the cities. There's not enough work in the Global South. They're behind on industrialization, and we have what Mike Davis calls the planet of slums, basically, is established. And the next thing that happens is that there's a huge oversupply of food globally because we're overproducing in the North, we're overproducing in the South. Where is all this food going to go? That's when we get our farm crisis, our 70s farm crisis in the US. Farmers, at first, there's a big boom because we're supposed to be saving the world from hunger. These are the development decades. The world's going to industrialize. We're going to create a lot of cheap food so industrialization can happen so that you can pay workers a low wage because there's a cheap food basket. But we overdo it, basically. And so farmers in this country start to go out of business. Now, the first farmers to go out of the business in the early 70s are African Americans. They're the first ones. Why? Because they're the most vulnerable. Why? Because the USDA in so many instances turns their back on them, which is all what the Pigford case was about. They were not getting fair treatment, equal treatment with the USDA. Is not forgiving the loans. Is basically not cutting black farmers any slack. And so black farmers begin to lose their land. At one time, following Reconstruction, African Americans were able to, by 1910 or so, were able to secure 15 million acres of farmland in this country without much help from anybody and coming out of slavery. Well, this begins to get dismantled tremendously in the 1970s, and the first wave of the farm crisis hits. Now, unfortunately, white farmers were not paying attention. And so this was not considered a problem, not considered an issue. It was, these farmers were just not good business people. But then as the crisis continues, white farmers begin to lose their land. And at first, it's the same trope. Well, you must not be a good farmer. Pretty soon, everybody's losing their land. We lost half of our farmers in that farm crisis in the late 70s. By the time the late 70s rolled around, we lost half of our farmers. We went from 4 to 2% of the population. And now, of course, we have more people in jail than we have on the land. So I just want to make that specific point before I go on to the next, that in fact, the structural racism within our food system at the time, had one been paying attention, would have indicated that we had a tremendous problem, which was about to affect the entire US farm system. But no one paid attention because it was only affecting black farmers. Anyway, the countries in the global south go bankrupt the same way that our farmers went bankrupt. The banks in the north can simply repossess farmers' lands. But you can't repossess Argentina, you can't repossess Mexico, you can't repossess a country. So what do to get back your money if you're a bank? You call on the World Bank, who then goes down and loans these countries money so that they can pay back the interest on the loans and keep up their payments. But there's a condition. They have to sign with the International Monetary Fund, who applies what we call structural adjustment policies, which are dismantle all of your grain reserves. You have to devalue your currency. Right? Stop producing food. Don't bother with food. Produce non-food products which you can sell on the international market so you can get dollars so you can pay back your loans. Deregulate and privatize. Get rid of, because there was a large state sector at the time in the global south, which was deeply involved in development. Basically get rid of all that, sell it off. And of course, those with the money are from the north and they can buy up. I mean, even telephone systems, national telephone systems, education systems, extension, agriculture extension disappears. So, and there are no safety nets, right? And then on the heels of that come the free trade agreements, right, which basically bake the structural adjustment policies into international treaty, where the populace can't get at them. Because, you could vote your president or vote the party out of office, and you can say, we're not going to pay anything. We're not going to pay. We're not going to do these things. We're not going to apply structural adjustment policies. Puts too many people out of work. It's destroying our economy. It's destroying our society. It's destroying our public sphere. It's destroying our communities. But once they're in the treaty, then you can't touch them. That's it. You go back on a treaty, you've got big problems. So we've gone from that to what we call the corporate food regime, because these sets of conditions have opened up a playing field where the free trade rules are basically, they're not about free trade at all, of course. The TTIP and the Transatlantic Partnership and the Partnership with Europe for Free Trade, which the president is arguing for fast track to be able to sign these things off, have nothing to do with free trade. They have to do with giving corporations rights above the constitutions of other countries, above the laws of other countries. That's what it's about. And I can talk more about that if you'd like. Anyway, and then we see, as a result of this, tremendous financialization of agricultural land and huge land grabs around the world and in this country. And these are land grabs, not only big land grabs, over 500 acres or 500 hectares, but also small land grabs, 5, 10, 15 hectares. Basically, we're seeing an agrarian transition, pushing people off the land and pushing them where? There's nowhere to go anymore. They can come to the north, and we've seen a huge demographic transition of people going from the south to the north looking for work. And this comes directly into our food system. That is usually the entry point for workers. Most of these workers are farmers. So they work on farms. They work in agriculture. And there's a whole system of contractors and coyotes and whatnot which facilitate this. And they work in the food system. They work packaging, they work in the processing plants, they work in the restaurants, and go into any fancy restaurant and go to the back of the house. You're going to find immigrants there working. People of color. Hidden very often from view. But without them, our food system would crash tomorrow. Our agriculture would crash tomorrow. So let me just, I can run by the results of this, but I'm not going to read this whole thing out to you. But the Global South used to produce a surplus of food. Back in the 70s, about $1 billion a year of food came out of the Global South. Now, the Global South has to import $11 billion a year. They're dependent upon the global market. And that was precisely the problem when the food price spikes hit. So this is great, comparative advantage in all this business, until the price goes up. And then if you've allowed your agricultural sector to be destroyed, then you have no more control over your food. And it's too expensive on the global market. And that's why you can't solve this very simple problem about here's the food and here are the people, let's just put them together, because you don't own the food anymore. Industrial agriculture uses up 80%. It's very inefficient. It's quite efficient in terms of capital investment and return, as long as the subsidies are in place. But it's very inefficient in terms of water use. It uses up 80% of the world's fresh water. Depending on which measurement you take and whether you include transportation and the entire life cycle of food, it produces around 20% or more of the world's greenhouse gases. And it has sort of unleashed this huge demographic transition. If you visited Europe lately, and you visit the Mediterranean, you know who's picking all the fruit. You know who's doing all the cooking. It's people from Africa. And of course, what we've seen, I forgot to finish talking about financialization, but it's up here. So at the same time, we have this tremendous concentration of wealth going on. And I explained why with the food system. The tremendous concentration of wealth going on. And we have a recession. So what are we going to do with all this money? Because if you don't reinvest it, your stockholders are going to leave you. So this is where the land grabs come in. These land grabs are nothing but land deals. And some of them are more shady than others. The big ones are especially shady. And very often it means dispossessing people, pretending they're not there. They're herders, they're pastoralists, they're small farmers. We say, oh, this is abandoned land. People live there. Or it's a commons. People use that land for hunting, for gathering, for different reasons. But this is the land which is being sold to large corporations around the world, not just U.S. corporations. Right? And one big reason is because they've got all this money, and they've got to put it somewhere. And the price of money is going down. The value of money is going down. That's why interest rates are basically zero. That's the price of money. That's interest. Zero. Money's not worth very much. Right? So get your money out of the bank, get it out of cash, put it in something where? Not in a factory, because then nobody's going to buy your goods. Land. Put it in land. And in this country, the modality is the financialization of land. So farmers, older farmers, many of them are cashing out. And some farmers who are not so old are also cashing out. Now, they can stay on the land through lease agreements, but basically the land itself is being sold. And once it enters the market, it gets chopped up into tiny little bits and splattered around the world, where it flies, in megaseconds, and is traded constantly, continually. People looking for a profit on the speculation of the value of this land. That's the financialization of our land. Now, where's the danger in that? Well, that's because, think of a farmer's time horizon. farmers thinking at least one generation ahead. My kids are going to take over the farm, hopefully, maybe more. How far does a speculator think? Seconds, minutes. How can you possibly manage a farm when your time horizon for investment is a minute? That's simply not biologically and ecologically and agroecologically coherent. But I would say, I think that I'm going to return to this, one of the most critical losses in all of this process, which we can see has been coming for hundreds of years, is the loss of the public sphere. So our public goods are being privatized, selling off everything. And we're losing the health, education, and welfare services that used to be provided by the state. Now they're provided by a lot of you, by the foundations. And of course, you can't possibly provide everything that's needed. The state is supposed to do that. And you're stepping in, trying to help communities deal with this crisis where they've lost these services, but they haven't just lost the services. For example, when a commons is privatized, you don't just lose the land, you lose the relationships between the people, knitted together at the community level, which ensure the sustainability not only of the land, but of the society that was rooted in that land and in that community. And so we shouldn't be surprised now that we see a tremendous social breakdown, particularly in the most vulnerable communities, which are communities of color and underserved communities in the United States in both rural and urban areas. And we're seeing land grabs in both rural and urban areas. In urban areas, we call it gentrification, right? And we're seeing a rise of social tensions, and a rise of racism, and a rise of police violence. Particularly over the last 6 months, this has been extraordinary. This doesn't come out of nowhere. This comes from these process of 20 years now of globalization, which we call neoliberalization, basically the liberalization of the market, privatization of everything, the loss of those social relations, that public sphere, which is the glue of our communities and our society, that protects us from the volatility of the market and the environment at this point. They call it the stochasticity of the environment. You don't know what's going to happen. And now with climate change, of course, that's going to be worse and worse. It's astounding to me, a report from Oxfam, which was looking at inequality, that basically 85 people own as much as the lower economic half of the world. That's just, now, this can't possibly be sustainable for the planet, at least for humanity. This is not sustainable. And you can just imagine, how are we supposed to solve these social contradictions under these sorts of structural circumstances? This goes beyond goodwill. This goes beyond giving, which we're all, those of us who are NGOs are, extremely grateful for all of philanthropic giving, but this goes beyond all of that. And I really think, so where do we go? So what do we do? And where do we go? Yes, now we lean in. I think we start with the public sphere. If we don't rebuild the human and social relationships which knit us together, that protect us, then I think we're doomed. I don't think, not only do I think we cannot reverse these trends, because we need to change the rules, we need to change the institutions, not just the practices. But if we don't do that, we will be forever atomized, fragmented, stratified, and in the worst cases, of course, working across purposes or competing with each other. As I'm sure many of you have seen, NGOs competing with each other for a smaller and smaller slice of the philanthropic pie. Well, I'm not going to read this to you, but I think if we're going to what we see, if you look around the world, people respond. They don't just sit with their arms folded because they can't. Because on one hand, there are people who are desperate to protect themselves, to their livelihoods, and on the other hand, there are people of goodwill who think that this situation is unconscionable and want to do something. The allies. And if you... Oh, I'm sorry. So, internationally, what we see in terms of the sort of a counter-movement to the neoliberalization of everything is the food sovereignty movement, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, which is a peasant movement, a fisher's movement, a pastoral movement, to take back the food system, to democratize the food system in favor of the poor. So it's not just about agroecology. It is about agroecology. It is about sustainability. But it's also about changing the rules. It's about getting agriculture out of the WTO. It's about redistributive land reform. It's about women's rights. It's about an end to all violence against women. Why? Because women produce 70% of the world's food. And women also make up 70% of the world's hungry, at least, women and girls. So you can't possibly talk about democratizing or better food if you're not talking about prioritizing women. They are the most negatively impacted. And so the strategy, the political strategy, the social strategy of the food sovereignty movement for changing the food system is to support the leadership of women, is to insist that we cannot fix the food system or change the food system without ending all violence against women. In other words, it's taking those who are most negatively impacted by the food system and making that the bottom line. That's this bottom line. That's this big bottom line, the bottom line of the social movements, and supporting the leadership. So when we look at how we have responded in the United States, we've responded the same way much of the world has responded, which is first we look to the safety nets. People need food, quick, how do we get them food? People need to grow food, quick, how do we help them grow food? We need to distribute this food, we need to, so we have anti-hunger, we have food access, so we have this proliferation of both governmental and non-governmental work, some very fine and very necessary emergency work to deal with the catastrophe that we have on hand. And this spills out into, other movements which may not be facing a crisis in the same way that underserved communities are, but are also deeply concerned and don't want the food system to go in the direction that it's going. They want to change things. And so we hear a lot about, well, we've got to fix this broken food system. Let's vote with our fork. Let's all grow organic. Let's eat local. A lot of sort of market-based solutions, right? Consumer-based solutions. These are all very important. I don't want to minimize the importance of all of this. These are essential. However, I think they're insufficient. And I think they're insufficient if we rephrase this, do we fix a broken food system, to how can this food system be broken? It's acting precisely as a food system in a period of late capitalism is supposed to work. It's acting precisely as the corporate food regime is supposed to work. This is a capitalist food system, and we're at a certain stage in capitalism on a global scale that is going to concentrate monopoly power and wealth in the hands of the few, and it's going to export the social and environmental externalities onto the rest of society. It's not broken. This system isn't broken. So that means we can't fix this system. What are we going to go back to? Indentured servants? The Bracero program? Slavery? Colonial? We don't want to go back to these things. So we clearly need to transform the system. We need something else. And I think that the clearest indication that we really need something else, is the food justice movement. Because these are the people in the United States who are most negatively impacted by the food system. And if you look at the construction of the food justice movement over the past 10, 15 years, you see that it has a lot of roots. always rooted in justice from different aspects in our society. And it is a movement of movements. But I would say within the larger food movement, it's that movement which anchors us with the most possibilities for change. This is a picture, some of you are smiling, of the breakfast program of the Black Panther Party. Now, I know that the Black Panther Party is terrifying to a lot of people. However, I think we have to understand that African American communities in the 60s were suffering many of the things that African American communities are suffering today. Namely, for example, inordinate levels of police violence and inordinate levels of diet-related disease and food insecurity. So the first thing that the Panthers did was just, one of the first things they did, they figured out was, do we need to feed our kids? And they fed 250,000 children every day with the wealth from the community, without a penny from the government, and without a penny from philanthropy. They embarrassed the US government into doing children's breakfast programs and lunch programs. This was actually food sovereignty. It was about people controlling their own food. So it really is sort of the radical essence of the food justice movement. We want our food system back, because the one you gave us is not working for us. It's killing us. The other thing which is very, I think, instructive about the Black Panthers, there's a lot of lessons about not what to do. But there are some lessons about what to do and how to think about things. And one is that for the Black Panthers, they saw very clearly that food was one plank in a larger platform of Black liberation. It wasn't just the food. It was the food and the housing and the education and an end to police violence. And, you know, this was their 10-point platform. And I think that in the food movement, there's a tendency, particularly amongst the sort of vote with your fork approach, to think that that's going to be enough. In other words, that the food system can fix itself in isolation of the larger system of injustice in our society and the larger state of inequality in our society. That's silly. I mean, when you think about it, you know, for a long time we just don't think about it. This is pretty cool. This seems to work. This is looking good. But when we have a more of a structural analysis, particularly of the structure of racism in the food system, institutionalized racism, we realize that that's not the case. Right? Poor people can't vote with their fork. There's no polling station. Right? So things are going to get less depressing in just a moment. Hang with me. So the good news, and you're going to say, that's the good news? No, there's more. The good news is we can now say the word capitalism out loud after Occupy. And before you had to go into this long explanation of what it was without saying it. Okay, so the important thing is we have a capitalist food system. Not a socialist one. It's a capitalist food system. It's the only kind in this country. And it has to act the way capitalism acts. It can act in no other way. So we know some things about capitalism. We've been studying it for several hundred years now. I usually don't get a chance to study it in school and take it to grad school. I think it should be required reading starting in kindergarten. Capitalism always goes through periods, two phases, one of liberalization and one of reform. Liberalization, what I've just described, we call it neoliberalism. It's where you basically take the gloves off the market, you privatize everything, everything has a market solution, and you get this tremendous concentration of wealth. You usually get a big crash, right? And then you have conditions for reform. So if you think back in the roaring 20s, we had a liberal market, and we get a big market crash, and then Franklin Delano Roosevelt is able to introduce the New Deal. The crisis starts with agriculture and ends, and the reforms begin with agriculture. The New Deal begins with agriculture. But there's two more things, very important. One is he wasn't able to do this out of the goodness of his heart. He was obviously resisted by those who were making money off the crash and didn't want to see any reforms. Certainly didn't want any labor reforms, and didn't want any reforms to the farm system or the markets. And so he was resisted by the oligopolies of the time. But there was a strong social movement in the United States. It was far-flung, it was diverse, it was everywhere. People were out of work, people were taken to the streets. Tremendous social pressure created the political will for the introduction of reforms. And people saw quite clearly that if they didn't introduce the reforms, it was very likely that not only might the United States sort of revert to socialism, which looked pretty good to a lot of people at the time, particularly those who didn't have any money, but capitalism might fall. It looked that way in Europe, certainly. So we need the crash, we need the threat, and we need the social movement, powerful social movement. I think, so here we have the corporate food regime, and we have the food movement. The corporate food regime has two tendencies. They're always present at the same time, but at any given time, one tendency will be stronger or hegemonic over the other. Right now, the neoliberals are much stronger than the reformists in our government. Look at the difference between, and by the way, government or institutions and organizations can be split down the middle. So we have Tom Vilsack, who's very much a neoliberal supporter, and we had Kathleen Merrigan, who was quite reformist, right? Now, she didn't last long. She was weak because the reformist trend, the reformist wing within our corporate food regime is very weak, whereas the neoliberals are very strong. They believe in an entrepreneurial food system, whereas the reformists believe in, safety nets and food security and making it not so bad. It's not that they don't believe in everything that the neoliberals believe in. They believe in markets and everything, but they don't want the poor to suffer. But then we have the food movement. And I would say between the women's movement and the food movement, these are the strongest movements in the world today, speaking internationally. And this might be one of the strongest movements in the United States, is the food movement writ large. Right? It is not terribly organized, but tremendous social potential here. And it's split between a very progressive tendency, which I would say is probably most of us, who are down on the ground getting it done. Yeah, the farmers markets, the farm-to-school programs, dealing with the crises and whatnot, trying to do things locally, trying to make try to make things work for people on the ground. And then you have a more radical trend. By radical, I mean goes to the root. And this would be the food sovereignty movement, which says, yeah, we need to do all those things, but we also have to change the rules and the structures. Get agriculture out of the WTO, land reform, democratize the food system in favor of the poor, whatnot. And a lot of this work is also happening locally. If you look at food policy councils, what do? They try to change the rules. It's so difficult to change the Farm Bill. If someone from Kellogg was here, they would probably take me to task on this or disagree with me on this. Because they spend millions of dollars trying to change the Farm Bill. They're not going to let you change that. That's a pillar of late capitalism. It's insulated by committees. We don't vote on this, neither does the rest of the world. But you can't change some things at the local level, some rules, some institutions. So we do have food sovereignty at the local level as well. I'm just saying these are tendencies. Even our organizations be kind of split within these political tendencies. If we want to change the food system, we know we need to have a powerful social movement. So at Food First, what we think, and we're not alone, is that we need to have strategic alliances between these radical approaches and these progressive approaches to build a powerful food movement. Now, what happens? Because the reformists are weak, they reach out to the progressives and attempt to draw the progressives into the reformist camp. If, in doing that, the progressives allow the relationship with the radicals to be split, then we've broken the back of the food movement. And we won't have a strong social movement. And we will not get reforms. Remember that reforms don't come about through the goodwill of reformists. It comes about from the pressure of a powerful social movement. So we need to build the right kinds of alliances. We need to think when we build alliances. Are these tactical? Are these strategic? And who are they with? I'm not suggesting that we abandon relationships or alliances with reformists or reforming institutions by any means. But I'm suggesting we have to think about, are these tactical or are they strategic? And I'm also suggesting that what we need to think about is not just any reform, because we don't want to go back to what we had before. We want to move forward into something new. So these have to be transformational reforms. And I think that the food justice movement is pivotal in this regard. I think as goes the food justice movement, so goes the food movement. Because the food justice movement throws its weight or is co-opted by lighter reforms, then I don't think we change anything in the long run. But if the food justice movement builds with the radical tendencies to build a strong food movement, then I think we have the chance to change things. And again, no one's terribly optimistic about anything. Sorry, I'm losing my batteries here, so I'm going to have to churn around each time I change a slide. Okay. What is keeping us from building these alliances? What keeps us apart? If these alliances were easy to build, we would have done them already. Huh? So what's getting in the way? I think that racism is getting in the way. I think we cannot have a powerful food movement without a powerful food justice movement. And I think that the institutionalized racism in the food system is reflected in the food movement. Well, why wouldn't it be? Of course it would be. And I think we have to dismantle the racism, not just in the food system, but in the food movement. And that means we have to address institutional racism, we have to address oppression, we have to address internalized racism, we have to address white privilege. And these are very difficult things to address. They're very painful. They're traumatic. And so we have to address historical trauma if we believe in social change, if we're committed to social change. And I would say that there are very hopeful things going on right now in society, painful but hopeful, and in the food movement as well. So that the struggles for justice within the black community, within the immigrant community, within the food worker community are essential to support if we want to transform this food system. So what does let's say a farmer in upstate New York on 10, 15 acres of land have a white farmer have in common with a black inner city gardener, besides that they grow food? They're both vulnerable in this food system. Remember what I told you about the farm crisis. It always starts with the most vulnerable. Had the farmers in this country built an alliance, that the white farmers built an alliance with the black and the Latino farmers when they had a chance, the farm crisis may not have been so bad. So we know what direction this is all going. So we know we have to build these alliances. And we don't know how to converge in all of this diversity. No one's ever done it before. Now, we have great examples of allies and alliances. If you look at the abolition movement, right, that's a great example. If you look at the Underground Railroad, that's also a great example of supporting black leadership, who were the protagonists of the Underground Railroad. supported by a lot of white people who believed that slavery had to end and that people should be free. So, as uncomfortable as racism is, as uncomfortable as white privilege is, with all of its guilt, its shame, its powerlessness, because this is what makes you powerless, is all the guilt and the shame. We need strong allies. We don't need allies who are powerless. So as a white man, if I want to change the food system, where do I start? I need to start by working on white privilege and my fear, and shame, and guilt, bound up in my white privilege. Otherwise, I'm not going to be a good ally to my brothers and sisters of color. And from the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, they call this transformational solidarity. And there's a lot of good work out there, some in the food movement and much beyond the food movement, about how you do this. How do we overcome historical trauma? This slide is from an indigenous organization trying to deal with historical trauma, and this is the cycle of how you get through it. Right? Some people have done quite a bit of work on this. So what I'm saying is that to dismantle racism in the food system, I'm giving you more and more and more work. Not only do we have to get the practices right, not only do we have to grow the organic carrots in the hood or wherever they have to be grown, not only do we have to change the rules, and not only do we have to change the institutions and build alliances, but we have to do the somatic work with these layers of racism which have been drilled into us. We didn't ask for this, but we've got it. We've got to do that work. Otherwise, we can't build a powerful movement. And what's important about that, I think, is that very often, too often, the work of dismantling racism is seen as something which is done extra. Well, we're going to have a workshop on that. We should have a workshop on it. But this needs to be a permanent practice. This needs to be a process. It's almost like we were born alcoholics, and we need a 10-step program. Racism is like an affliction, right? It's not genetic. It's socially constructed. There's no racist gene in any of us. There's no internalized oppression gene in any of us. These are all social constraints. But to undo them, it has to be just part of our practice. Because as we begin to undo the different aspects, emotional, social, structural aspects of racism, racism changes. The structure changes. And we are different. And then we move on to the next steps, to the new things. So it's something that has to be cross-cutting, that has to be integrated. Food First is going to be doing this. We're hiring a brilliant young researcher of color named Breeze Harper, some of you, to help us construct a new program in Food First, which will be cross-cutting, for dismantling racism in the food system. And we want to bring in, we want to have scholarships for young researchers of color, particularly young men and women who are at the community colleges, who will stay in their communities, and who will develop an action research capacity in their communities and in their local organizations, whom we can work with, right? Because right now, Food First has brilliant interns that come from universities, but just because they're privileged, and we can't afford to pay anybody, so you can imagine our demographic with our interns. It's not terribly diverse. Of course, this is much more than just about the diversity. It's about Food First taking a stand and saying, okay, we're going to transform Food First from the inside out. So I just think that we're well on our way to holding a common vision. And Adam and I were talking before we came, and I think one of the terrible problems for activists today, for the left or for progressives, not for right-wing activists, quite frankly, but for anybody left of center, the terrible problem is that we have lost our utopias. Utopias are extremely important. Not because you lose yourself in the utopia, but because the utopia helps to guide you. It's a light post in this very dark and confusing scenario in which we find ourselves. So, what would our food system look like if food workers were food secure? What would our food system look like if farm workers received fair wages and had decent working conditions, regardless of their immigration status? What would our food system look like if women were recognized as feeding most of the world? And what would our food system look like if Black Lives Mattered? Thank you.
All right, actually, I think Kolu is going to kick us off into Q&A, and we're going to transition this. Take a deep breath. If anyone, just kind of housekeeping, there are bathrooms and drinks and coffee and snacks outside there. We're going to do Q&A, we can pass the mics ourselves. If you guys can help turn on the microphones. Again, this is for the live stream and the recording. And then just help each other pass the mics around to whoever wants to go first. Just turn on the green light. And
Thanks so much, Eric, and I hope everybody will, jump into this conversation. I was particularly struck with the idea of, since the food regimes go back to the 16th century and possibly before, and therefore, that's part of the structural nature of sort of this exploitative system. How do we decolonize our thinking? I just came back from India, and there's so many places in the world where it's kind of accepted that the model of the West is the way to go. It almost becomes self-perpetuating, where folks just believe that, well, it worked for them, and now we're in this position of, the radical and progressives amongst us are now in this position where we're like, no, it's not working, it's terrible, we have continued hunger and continued inequality. And meanwhile, they're thinking, well, we want to actually be like you. So that question of, and then it turns to decolonizing our own minds here, right, where we have that siloed approach. And so we may feel like, well, we're very progressive in our grant making because, but then we're maybe not looking at our investment portfolio, or perhaps, and I see that related to this question of structural racism, because in some ways it's really about the structure of the historic structure is really about, let's stick with black-white binary. Black people were the commodities and could not accumulate capital, and were the source of capital accumulation for whites. And the very simplistic way that, quite frankly, I see it is that progressive philanthropy now should be redistributing wealth, and there should be a conscious effort to put as much as possible back into those communities where wealth was extracted. And so there, is this deficit, and we see this growing divide. And yet it's not as easy as it sounds, because those are the very communities that are under-resourced, so typically don't have the infrastructure to, we create these criteria for where we want to invest. We want there to be an infrastructure to absorb our capital, So those are a couple of things, like how do we change our modus operandi, here, and stop exporting this. So I'd throw that out, and Eric said a lot of things, and you don't have to answer my question. You can just say your own questions, and we're trying to get the questions and the comments on the mic.
Yeah.
Okay, so are there folks who? who want to jump in with question or?
So one of the things you were talking about is this burgeoning food movement, and you had a great chart up there where you were talking about food justice and food sovereignty on the new food movement side as opposed to the existing corporate system. One of the things that I see, that a lot of us see food as, is breaking down silos because it's ingrained in all of these other movements, including immigration, labor rights, fair wage movements, environmental movement, et cetera, et cetera. The problem that I have is when those movements that exist already don't see food as important. So how can we go about using those existing movements that have long histories of their own, like the labor movement, and getting them to see food as an important and critical part of what's interconnected to what they're already doing and how to make it their priority?
Why don't we?
Get a few, let's get a few comments and questions. People are absorbing.
I guess I would like to ask, as I sit here with my foundation hat on, we're focused on youth-powered food justice. How do we apply this? Help us think through how we, in each of our foundations, with each of our focus areas and boards of directors expecting us to bring certain kinds of projects to the board meetings, how do we move from where we are? How do we apply what we've just learned?
You who you're standing, oh, you just walked in, or sorry.
Oh, are we putting all the questions down? Sorry.
Yeah, we're putting the
Why don't we
questions on the
start with
table.
some and then go- sure.
Yeah.
We take one more before.
I had Michael up there to talk about.
This financialization of farmland in the U.S. and the forms that takes, and what, to the extent that you have any information or data about what the practical implications of that are around fragmentation and the cost of land and some of the things we need to do if we're going to change who has access to farmland again and make it more equitable and democratic, never mind progressive or radical. And then the second one is examples where there has been exciting solidarity work happening. The guy from the Organic Farmers Association spoke at the Sustainable Ag and Food Systems Funders Conference, for example, a couple years ago in Minneapolis, about how they actually instituted some of the deeper thinking around that chart you had up about the role, the traditional farm labor party and coalition movement that used to happen in the Midwest, for example, and that's all gone, and efforts to rebuild that. And their understanding as organic and sustainable farmers, the need to build solidarity across racial and ethnic groups. Where you think exciting stuff is happening either in the US or abroad.
And I have a question, but I also just had a comment. I wanted to thank you for clarifying, being so clear about the process of the structural adjustments and loan and the financialization of farmland. And I lived in Panama for many years during the 90s and early 2000s when we saw all of those things happen in a row. Structural adjustments, the free trade agreements, the effect on farmland, and then this movement to title land, which essentially meant getting rid of the commons and getting rid of rights of usufruct. And I never had it explained so clearly, the relationship between those things. Related to that, I'm just curious about how, those are relating issues around inequality in the food system in this country to global issues of inequality and international movements is I think difficult. I think we tend to, especially from the foundation point of view and as funders, we tend to think about national issues and even local issues around local food movements. And so I would be interested to hear more about how we can educate ourselves and others and start to think about how what's going on here with inequality and food and racism, what's going on in the rest of the world, and what are those links?
Okay.
All right, let's take those. That was quite a lot.
Well, these are very good questions to which I don't have any simple answers, clearly. But to help us think about them more, I mean, clearly decolonizing our thinking is essential, because I believe that most of us don't realize how far our thinking has been colonized. And it's not just folks in the global south who want the model from the north. It's a lot of us here who actually believe in so much of the model, or who may not believe in the model, but who are not thinking outside the box. And I think, for example, the trend, this is especially true in California, in the Bay Area, so close to Silicon Valley. You know, the trend is that you can sort of innovate your way out of poverty. So the support is all for innovation, with no recognition of the conditions that people face in underserved communities. When you say, you know, why don't you just do a startup? You know, why don't you do more entrepreneurial? So I think that, you know, and this in the Bay Area, this sounds perfectly logical, because that's how everybody's thinking. And so people's thinking is being colonized. People's thinking is being colonized, particularly around the public sphere. That I teach quite a bit at the universities, different universities, and many of my students don't know what the public sphere is. They never saw a government that actually paid them to go to school. Now the government, you know, which takes their money, or the school takes their money, they're going to pay them. They're going to take their money. They come out of school with, you know, a $60,000 debt and a liberal arts degree, and we need liberal arts education. I mean, you shouldn't have to pay $60,000 for it. But people think this is normal. It's like, because and don't realize that, in fact, we used to have many more public goods. We used to have a stronger public sector. And so, for example, the whole issue with unions. It's only recently you begin to read the New York Times where they're saying, gee, unions are actually important. As onerous or honorary, rather, as unions can be. In fact, we had a lot less inequality in this country when we had unions. And you can graph the fall of unions with the rise of inequality. And that, you know, maybe we should be thinking about unions. And one of the questions here is about unions. You know, where do we see some of the strongest moves towards forms of unionization is in the food movement. Is with food workers. Now, they won't call themselves unions, and there's reasons for that, because if you are a formal union, then things like you can't strike, which I always thought that was why you joined a union. So you have the Food Chain Workers Alliance, you have the Restaurant Opportunity Center, you have the brand workers here in New York, and most of these people are people of color. Many of them are, not most, are immigrants. So it's extremely important, if we believe in reviving our union sector and supporting the organization of workers, to support those who are actually doing it. And so much of it is below ground, is out of sight. Why? Because they're people of color. And they're hidden in the first place, hidden in the back of the house, hidden in the processing plants, hidden in detention centers, hidden in work camps. There's no interaction and whatnot. So I think, and we see very imaginative forms of organizing amongst these workers, like the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. What they've done is brilliant. Now, they're dealing just with their community of tomato pickers, right? From Immokalee, and they're trying to branch out from that. So what about the workers in Tacoma, in Bellingham, Washington, at the Sakuma Berry Farm? You know, Immokalee, it doesn't work. I mean, there's no real connection there, but that model is interesting for the struggles on the Sakuma farm. I think that, you know, as a food movement, we have to highlight these struggles and find ways to support them. And these struggles give us hope. In the larger scheme of things, you can say, well, okay, so they're getting a penny more per pound in Immokalee. And those are still contaminated tomatoes these guys have to pick, full of pesticides. They're getting sick. I mean, they still live in terrible working conditions, and, you know, on and on and on. They still are undocumented and vulnerable to just about everything as a result. So what's that doing? I think the point is that these are emblematic struggles. And by emblematic, I mean that they are like lighthouses. They are, we have to raise these up. We have to learn from, support them and learn from these experiences with the hopes that they inspire and engender many, many more. And we have to then begin to look for the connections and whatnot. And I think that's part of this, you know, breaking down silos is exactly that. The food movement actually does break down a tremendous amount of silos, much more than in some of the other sectors, because of the intersectionality of the oppression within the food system, and because food cuts across just about everything. You want to talk about climate, you have to talk about food. Energy, food. The economy, food. And it's inescapable, you know, because yes, everybody eats, but who gets to eat how is the point, and who provides the food and how is the point. And so there already is a tremendous amount of breaking down these silos within the food system itself. So then the challenge is, can the food movement consistently reach across these silos? I think that a common commitment to dismantling racism in the food system helps us to reach across these silos. Everybody does it. That will bring us onto the same plank, if not the same platform. So how do we actually do this? And where are the examples of where it's being done well, both nationally and internationally? You know, what is the work? This is the work. Okay, but what exactly is the work that's the work? So how do we exactly do the work that's the work? It's not extra. It's not something we'll do later. It's something I have to do right now. Okay, so the biggest emblematic example that I can think of is between Via Campesina and the World March of Women. And the two biggest movements in the world today. Why? Because neoliberalism has fallen hardest on the peasantry and on women. So some time back, they formed an alliance, a strategic alliance, not a tactical alliance like, you know, we like you, you like us, we'll talk about you, you'll talk about us, that's fine. But women saw very clearly that because 70% of the food in the world is grown by women, that they needed to address food sovereignty. If, you know, why is food so terribly cheap and why are conditions so terribly bad in the third world countryside? Is in large part because of patriarchy, because women are the ones growing the food so much. So to a large degree, I'm not saying exclusively, but to a large degree, discrimination against women is why producing food is such a bad thing to do for your life, as a livelihood. Right? So they knew that taking back power as women was essential, and one of the places they had to take back power was over the food. And there are all kinds of reasons. You know, women are responsible for keeping everybody healthy, for the nurturing, for the feeding, for the, you know, for the everything. So food sovereignty obviously was very, very important because it's about the power over the food system. Sovereign in terms of what? Sovereign in terms of the corporate food regime. So Via Campesina also saw that they were never going to be able to advance. So you can't advance women's rights without food sovereignty. And Via Campesina saw very clearly that they couldn't advance food sovereignty without taking an absolute principled and uncompromising stand on violence against women. So Via Campesina requires within Via Campesina that 52% of all the representatives within Via Campesina are women. Okay, so that's sort of an affirmative action thing within Via Campesina. That's great. That's not enough. They said, on top of that, we stand for an end to all violence against women, otherwise you can't have food sovereignty. So a demand for food sovereignty is an end to all violence against women. Now, this is a strategic alliance, right? And the type of alliance that addresses patriarchy. And that's the type of alliance, I believe, that we need to address racism as well. Now, it's not easy. I've been in meetings, some of us have been in meetings with Via Campesina and talking to our colleagues and comrades within Via Campesina who sort of tear their hair out about this alliance because it's not easy, it's hard. And, it gets sticky and people fight and people, of course. These are imposed contradictions. These are imposed tensions. We have to work our way through them. Within the United States, one of the very promising things I've seen, particularly in the Bay Area in California, are the food policy councils. And the Oakland Food Policy Council, which Food First was asked to help launch, not because we're a think tank or anything, but because there was like $50,000 from the city available for a food policy council, and no one wanted it because you had to come up with matching funds. And after 3 years of all the local organizations saying, we can't do it, they said, well, Food First, will you please do it? So we did, and we spun it off very quickly. But that Food Policy Council was very careful to be representative, doesn't represent, but be representative of labor and small business and the churches and the CBO sector, and has people from local government as well, and is racially representative of Oakland. If you walk in, you're looking at Oakland. And so immediately, of course, all the issues come up. All the issues of white privilege and racism and whatnot, they're right there, they're in the room. We've got white folks, we've got people of color, they're coming in under very different conditions, with very different opportunities and capabilities under the system. And then here we're trying to forge a common platform to transform the Oakland food system. So whose interest are we going to take up right away? What's the program? What's the action plan? Which are the policies which we're going, and this has to be negotiated amongst the Food Policy Council. This is what we have to do. I mean, where it's difficult and where I see this action as an example of convergence and diversity. But once we converge in all diversity, then all of a sudden all the sticky issues come up, right? And so on one hand, there's not time or inkling to understand the larger structural issues which are influencing the Oakland food system and how the local food system needs to respond to those strategically. But that's what Food First is supposed to do. We're supposed to help supply that information, and we do it as much as we can. But on the other hand, I think the interpersonal relationships of the people and interorganizational relationships of people who are enmeshed in a racist system are not necessarily being well addressed. I think there needs to be more support to all of our food movement organizations to incorporate and integrate all aspects of dismantling racism in the system, the movement, the organization, ourselves. And regarding land, this is possibly next to racism, the question of our time. because it is all being grabbed. Every bit of property on this planet is being grabbed. And it's in those with small pieces of property, not just land, any kind of property, intellectual property, you name it, are vulnerable to a grab, a property grab. And because of the tremendous deregulation of the financial system and the corporate system, we don't enforce our antitrust laws in this country. And we don't enforce we've dismantled the financial regulations and whatnot. We need those back. I mean, so I think the first thing is to realize this is happening, and the scale in which it is happening. Because there's a site, you can Google it, called the Land Matrix, and the Land Matrix will tell you that something like 88 million acres of land has been grabbed worldwide over the last few years. But they're only measuring these great big land grabs, right? And the ones you can find, because some of them are pretty shady deals and you can't find them. And so, they're looking at China and Korea and the United States and Goldman Sachs and our retirement funds, CREF and whatnot. And they're looking at, Harvard University or NYU. Harvard, by the way, just bought up 10,000 acres of farmland in California, was rangeland. They just put in 3,000 acres of grapes, and they grandfathered in an old clause. This is actually a water grab. It's not a land grab at all, because we're in a drought in California, and so now we're beginning to regulate groundwater. So Harvard bought up the land before the regulation came in. So they grandfathered in the old water rights access to their land holding. And they're quite transparent about it. They say, well, this is what's going to drive the price of the land up. So this is a good investment for the largest endowment in the history of the world. Is to grab all this land. And so all the surrounding farmers, and they're taking it from rangeland, which is rain-fed, and to grapes, which needs groundwater. If they'd been taken from almonds to grapes, it would have been better. No, it's the other way around. But so these grabs are coming both through this financial logic, and those are the big grabs. But the small grabs are anybody with some cash. And the steady gentrification of our neighborhoods, and the steady loss of small parcels of farmland to urbanization. And if we don't make the decision that we're going to protect these things and put them in the under some sort of regulatory protection, it's going to disappear. So pushing back, you have actually I have another presentation, and it's got all the on land, which I'm going to be giving in the Berkshires. I think I'm going to be giving here in New York too, on land. I forget where. I'll tell you in a second. Remind me. So how have people fought back? Well, we start these land trusts. And so with the land trust, you're kind of establishing a form of a commons, right? Because it's got some rules. A commons now, we have to differentiate between a commons and open access. Anybody ever read The Tragedy of the Commons or hear about it? So Hardin was completely confused. He thought that open access was commons. Open access, there are no rules. So the ocean is open access. Some forests are open access, deep in the Amazon maybe, if there are no indigenous people there. It's open access. He thought that their commons was an open access. Commons, and had no rules, and so individuals just destroyed it because they were trying to make profits. That's ridiculous. No commons has ever been run like that. Commons have a tight set of rules, tight set of social relations. The difference with the commons is in a market is that, in a market we have equal rights to buy and sell, but we don't have equal power. because you have maybe more market power than I do, and I have more market power than somebody else because I have more money. In a commons, everybody has equal power. And that's the difference. So the problem with, I think that trusts are very important. Land trusts and easements and this is very important. Both because otherwise we'll lose this land, both urban and rural, right? And because they're emblematic. They can show us how things could be if they were in fact institutionalized on a larger scale through government. The problem is that we'll never be able to buy enough land to solve the housing crisis through a land trust or to solve the farm crisis through a land trust. We'll never be able to buy enough land to distribute it to the young farmers who need land and can't afford it, who are most. Just about all the young farmers who want to take over the land can't afford it. And the people who do own land can't afford to give it to their children. They've got to sell it. So it's not a solution. So in the end, the solution does have to come from a much different regulatory framework around property and land. And in this country, it's almost forbidden to have a conversation around property. We have to talk about property and what forms of property are destructive for our society and for our communities, and what forms of property are going to help us rebuild our communities. And there's very interesting proposals. There are two things. One are the food hubs, I think are very important, although they're at a tremendous economic disadvantage, and a lot of them fail. And yes, you have to get the numbers right, but again, it's not enough to get the numbers right. You're going to have to change the rules as well, otherwise you can't possibly compete in the long run. And the other is commons. There's in California one thing called the food commons. And what they're trying to do is bring together financing, property, and markets and into not just a food hub, but a food commons. Because you need the three legs of the stool. And for that, and I think Philadelphia has shown this to be the case, you also need the three legs of the stool. You need the private sector, you need philanthropy, and you need government to establish these things. Otherwise, philanthropy can't do it by itself. The private sector doesn't have any incentive to do it by itself. They're trying to do it in California. It hasn't happened yet. The commons hasn't happened yet. What they're saying is the property and the financing. Thank you. So it's the property. So, for example, the distressed properties, they should be appropriated and turned over. The blighted properties. We tried to do this in Richmond. In fact, we did do it in Richmond, California. And now the real estate industry is suing the city of Richmond. So it's a fight. But of course it's going to be a fight. It's not going to be a fight. We're just talking about property. And so take back the property which is available, take it back before it gets sold on international markets and then you've lost it because who knows where the owner is then. And the financing, so federal financing, which would be partnered with state and local financing. And then you have to establish the market. So protect some form of market and establish a market and protect a market. I'm not as familiar with the experience in the Midwest, but in California, it hasn't gelled yet. It hasn't. Yeah.
I know we have sort of the whole body of scholarship for lunch, and if you haven't read Changes on the Land, everyone should read it to understand the evolution of property rights in the United States. William Herman's PhD thesis at Yale on comparing white European property rights institutions to Native American property institutions that existed at the time of conquest when all that started. I think it's about those pieces of trying to use common property and notions of how ecological and how ecosystems can be managed differently, both as a
you know, there's a lot of public land. The problem is, you know, we lease it to a lot of private ranchers who then want to secede from the government. But it could be different, right? I mean, there could be different sets of social conditions for this public land.
I think this is where the imagination part that you were saying, that we need that sort of North Star, that utopian vision, and we begin to see places where there's possibilities. So whether it's existing public land or maybe underutilized nonprofit land, or like the church spaces.
Well, we're negotiating with the city in Oakland. There's a lot of blighted property and abandoned property, and we formed 2 land trusts, and we want the city to sell us that land at a very discounted rate, so that we can turn this into a social good, a public good. Are we done?
No. I think we're going to say I was. It is 5 o'clock, so we need to wrap up. But I did want to invite you to just talk about for a minute Food First, how you receive your funding, and then I'll say a few words to close this out.
Okay. Well, I'll answer that by answering another question too, in terms of looking at the existing solidarity work in home and abroad and part of the decolonization of our minds. First does food sovereignty tours. So we take people around the world. We have to be very creative about how we finance our operation, because we don't get much money from foundations. I'll say something more about that in a minute. But we take people around the world. We go to 6, 7 different countries. We go to South Korea, go to the Basque Country, Cuba. We've got a trip coming up to Hawaii, go to Bolivia, and we meet with food sovereignty movements around the world and find out what they're doing. And usually the people who are on these tours are very interesting as well. They're engaged. And we have a small scholarship fund, which is financed by the participants themselves. Actually, we tack on a special bit on the fee, so that we make sure there's always at least a third farmers on our tours. We have students, journalists, activists, a lot of retired folks come on our tours. And we found them to be really good learning experiences in terms of what does food sovereignty look like. We also do tours in the United States. We have a food justice tour in California, which, for example, the Basque Farmers Union came and took that food justice tour because they wanted to understand this about dismantling racism. They wanted to understand because the Basque countries had a tremendous influence. Well, the Basques have always been mistreated by the Spaniards and the French, and discriminated against. I know this from my heritage. So, but the tremendous influx of immigrants into the Basque country, we need to know how to deal with this. And they came to us, and I was thinking, well, we could tell you what not to do, maybe, but they want to know about the food justice movement. So there's a lot of good cross-pollination there. We don't make money on these tours because most of the money stays in country where we go with our partners, farmers organizations and whatnot in country. But we expose people to the issues, and we sort of bring people into the Food First family. And then we ask them to contribute. Food First has 5,000 donor members who contribute anywhere from $5 to $5 or some $10,000 to Food First every year. And we don't have a terribly big budget. We have a wide net of fellows and colleagues that we work with to do our research. We only have 7 staff. With this core funding, every once in a while we get some foundation money. I found that foundations usually don't like to fund think tanks, don't like to fund research. I think this is a mistake. Both because of my own position within Food First, but the right wing funds the think tanks. And all they have to do is sit back and generate this intellectual garbage, which then develops a social consensus around the privatization of everything, militarization, and all this business. And the progressive foundations are so busy trying to hold things together and finance food security on the ground that there's nothing left over for a think tank. I think that's a mistake. I think we need to finance the how do I put this? The analysis and articulation of the struggles on the ground. We need to give that a language that everybody can share. And particularly around this issue of dismantling racism, we especially have to be producing lots of materials, lots of analysis, lots of books, lots of articles about this issue, blogs, you name it. We need to be having conferences and all these things. And that has to be financed. And Food First can't finance it with our 5,000 members. This isn't a pitch. I'm really making it, an observation about where we are in the food movement in our relationship with philanthropy. I think that's it. I invite all of you to join Food First and become a member of Food First. Just remember that, once you're a member of the Food First family, you can check out, but you can never leave.
Great. Thank you so much. I wish we had more time for discussion and questions. I was going to ask, well, what should we here, community food funders, do next? But maybe that's a question for all of us. And hopefully we're going to be willing to continue that conversation. In meetings, in our own foundations with our trustees, we'll figure that out. I do want to just again point out and thank the New York City Food Forum members for coming as well. We do have a group of folks on the ground here in New York City that are putting dismantling racism first and foremost in the work that's happening, and we have folks that we can partner with, and I encourage everyone to get to know the work of New York City Food Forum if you don't already. But please, let's not let this be just a workshop. Let's not have this be just this briefing. I have no idea what comes next. We don't have the answers, but I think what I've heard today is that it needs to be a dialogue. We need to do it together. Get your trustees involved. Get the board members involved. Bring them to whatever it is that we decide is going to come after this to continue this conversation and see where we go. Because it would be a shame to let this be an amazing, impactful conversation that happened one day and nothing come out of it. So thank you all for coming. Let's thank Eric one more time. We could stick around for a little bit if we need to. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me. I would love a picture with everybody. Would you like pictures? Sure.